Okay, it's 2:02 p.m., so we're going to go ahead and get started. So I'd like to wish everyone a good day and welcome to the Drone Responders webinar today on the 5 C's. This is really to start discussing about the principles on the responsible use of drones by public safety agencies. And as the statement says here in front of us, in order to realize the benefits of drones, agencies must use drones in a responsible manner that acknowledges the importance of community engagement and the protection of privacy and civil liberties. To advance that objective, Drone Responders is proud to release a set of foundational principles to guide the development and deployment of drones by first responders. This is a collaboration with Skydio. We're very pleased that they've been a big part of what we're doing here in the discussion and the preparation. So with that, we have the 5 C's, principles on the responsible use of drones by public safety agencies. Next slide. With me today is, of course, myself, Chief Charles Werner. I am the Director of Drone Responders, and I will be your moderator. Our other speaker is Chad Karlowicz, Police Commander from Renton Police Department and a Deputy Director of Drone Responders. And from the FAA, we have Michael O'Shea, Program Manager at UAS Integration Office from the Federal Aviation Administration, and Head of Regulatory and Policy Affairs at Skydio, Brendan Groves. Welcome to all of you all for being here today, and I appreciate your time. Next slide. So as you all may have experienced, we have been observing some flights and some operations that have raised concern. It may have been during COVID-19, and during COVID-19 we saw some flights where there were very good intentions, but they might not have been executed very well or may have been a learning lesson. For example, trying to maintain social distancing, sometimes the speakers were used, they were undistinguishable as far as what was being said, made some confusion. We also saw some opportunities where people were using them and they weren't the best thing to be used. And we should not be using any kind of technology for technology's sake. We should be using because it's the best tool in our toolbox for that particular mission. So when we talk about the 5 C's, this document that has been produced, again, in collaboration with Skydio and Drone Responders, it's the principles on the responsible use of drones by public safety agencies. And the 5 C's are basically, number 1, community engagement and transparency, civil liberties and privacy protection, common operating procedures, and clear oversight and accountability. And last but not least is cybersecurity, which is probably one of the more complex issues that we have to deal with. Next slide. And I'll turn this over to Chad.
Good morning, everybody, or afternoon, depending on where you're at. Yeah, I'll start off with the first 3 that we have here in our 5 C's. The first one is community engagement and transparency. And on this point, I really wanted to iterate the importance of engaging your community in all aspects and all phases of your drone program. So from the very beginning, if your agency is contemplating starting a drone or UAS program, that's the time to start engaging the public right from the get-go. And it continues throughout your entire program. Even an agency like ours, we've been up and going for almost 5 years now. We are still very engaged with our community. And so it doesn't stop once you get your program up and going. It's something that you have to continue with throughout your program, because it's going to change. Your program will change as you develop, and you're going to be wanting to do different things that you, as technologies are developed, there's different things you're going to want to do. So you're going to want to go back each time and stay in contact with your community and make sure that they have your full trust and they trust that you are doing what you say you're going to do. I like to frequently, I work with a lot of agencies getting their programs up and running, and I always mention that this looks different for every community. They always want different things. For example, our community wanted us to record everything so that they could check on us to see that we were doing what we said we're going to do. But I've worked with other agencies where the public didn't want anything recorded. Obviously, depending on your uses, that's not always possible. If you're doing crime scene reconstruction or documentation, that you have to do some recordings and take photographs and that kind of thing. But you need to engage your community and make sure that they trust what you're doing, and that you earn that trust every day. So that's the first one, community engagement, and be transparent with them. Basically, give them what they are asking for and they will be happy with you. The next one is civil liberties and privacy protections. This one's kind of, depending on where you live in the country, this is a big deal to a lot of people. So somewhere in your policy, you need to have something that says something to the effect that you will not ever do random surveillance. That's not what these tools are for. You need to be very clear and specific with your community what you're going to use the drones for, and assure them that your interest is in protecting their privacy as well and their civil liberties. So you're not there to invade their privacy at all. It's just a great tool for us to use in public safety, and you need to explain to them how we're going to do that without invading their civil liberties or their privacy. It's really not that difficult. Again, it goes back to the first C, which is just engage your community, have conversations with them, explain to them exactly what you're doing, and you'll be good on this point. But it's a very contentious point in some jurisdictions, so you need to really pay attention to this one.
And Chad, if I could add just a piece to that, there is some general guidance that we can take from the ACLU to incorporate into our policies and procedures, not verbatim, but there is some information there that will help to appease a lot of people in that realm.
Yeah, absolutely. ACLU has a model policy, which at a bare minimum you should read and be familiar with when you're developing your policy. Like Charles said, you're likely not going to adopt every single aspect exactly as they wrote it, but the vast majority of what is in that model policy is really good. It's good policy to follow. So I would encourage you to do that. And number 3, a common operating procedure. Again, really this, for me, this goes back to we should all be finding and developing what the best practices in our industry are for public safety, and we all need to follow those same best practices. And those have developed and changed over the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, and I expect that they will continue to change as we go forward. But we all need to be on the same wavelength as far as what the best practices are. We need to develop training. We need to develop certification processes. This, ways that we can say, yeah, you're a qualified pilot. There's just a whole bunch of different aspects to this that we need to be working on and all get on the same page. Everything, we have 6 topics down at the bottom of this slide, for example. Obviously, we all need to follow FAA regulations. I am embarrassed to say that I know of several agencies that don't follow the FAA rules like they should. Training proficiency and credentialing requirements. That, again, there's a lot of agencies that I'm aware of that they get their 107 or they get a COA and they go buy drones and then they don't touch them again ever unless they have a mission come up, which is a terrible practice. There should be a mechanism for authorizing missions. I mean, before you even start a drone program, you need to know why you want to use them. What missions do you intend to use them for? And that's going to drive everything else as you develop your program. So a piece of that needs to be what mission specifically are you authorized to utilize drones for? So that there needs to be something in your policy about that and an approval process for certain missions. And then video management or photograph management, your digital evidence, how you're going to handle that stuff. And of course, the non-weaponization is the last piece of this. That's the first 3.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Chad. This is Brendan Gross from Skydio. Before we hit the 4th principle, I wanted to circle back on the training, proficiency, and credentialing requirements, because to my knowledge, the Drone Responders 5C is actually the first time that any sort of guidance document has discussed brand new ASTM training standards for public safety operators. So Chief Warner, I don't know if you wanted to walk through that really quick.
Sure. I think the exciting thing here is we have the ASTM standard that's came out, 3379-20, which talks specifically about public safety requirements for remote pilots. And what we're hoping from that is the combination of ASTM and NIST will give us that training standard that Chad kind of touched on in the beginning, that we can use these tools to give us some way of defining proficiency. And when we hear that a company or a department is training to public safety, that there's something they can reference to meet a standard. So that's an exciting part of what we see next.
Great, thanks. So we can go to the next slide and cover the 4th principle now, which is oversight and accountability. You may think this sounds like the most boring principle, but it may actually be the most important principle because the others depend on doing this one well. People are going to check your homework when you start a drone program. When I say that, I'm speaking from experience. I'm a recovering federal official. I ran DOJ's program and developed it and led it and grew it over about 4 years, and just recently joined joined Skydio on the industry side. And during that experience, you know, I became very familiar with the importance of strong oversight. And I think it's a great credit to drone responders, and it's going to be a great credit to the public safety community that the 5 C's emphasize the importance of proactive oversight, where the agency itself in developing and operating the program is getting out ahead and not waiting for RFIs to come in from the city council or the county government, or in my case, the Congress, but actually being proactive, reaching out and telling the story. You know, if you're just responding to RFIs from oversight bodies, no matter who they are, if it's municipal or state or federal government, you're probably losing out. What the 5 C's preach is tell your story. That's how you build a program that builds trust. And every program has a good news story to tell. I think there's just a few points that we can kind of tease out at a high level here for purposes of today's webinar. Would obviously love to hear some feedback of others who've encountered this. The first is, you know, be proactive, right? So when we were developing DOJ's program, which is one of the largest, if not the largest, public safety drone programs now in the world, you know, there's this oversight body called the U.S. Congress that's very interested in what the Department of Justice is doing for very good reason. So we didn't wait for the Congress to ask us how we were using drones. We went to them and we showed them our vision. We said, this is where we want to go. If we had had a drone on this operation in City X with the U.S. Marshals, for instance, this agent might still be alive. We want to employ drones in a way that protect the public too. If we'd had a drone here in this city on this operation, we think maybe this person would still be with us today. And here are all the mechanisms and the oversight authorities we're going to use internally to ensure that we're policing ourselves. So it took a lot of work. It added months to the timeline, but what it did is it built this foundation of trust that I think served the department well, and other state and local agencies have done the exact same thing, and it's always worked out really well. There's no doubt about it. It's gonna take a lot of your time. It's gonna take a lot of your focus. But if you don't do it, what you'll get is a whole lot of questions under, you know, heated lights after something goes wrong, and there won't be a reservoir of trust to rely on. So I think, again, it's a credit to Chief Warner and team that they've advocated a different approach. The other 2 principles are, you know, more information is usually better when you're talking about your internal oversight procedures. Sharing more information about what you do, probably better. Those of us in the law enforcement world, we don't always do that. But in this case, it is better to share a little more with your oversight bodies about how you're actually protecting privacy, how you're managing the program. And third, and this is somewhat obvious, but, you know, people fear what they don't understand. So the more they know how you're going to protect the principles that Chad outlined, the more trust they'll have that you're using this technology for good. So we can go to the next slide. So we come to the 5th and final principle. This one is important, like Chief Warner said, and the reason is kind of simple, right? So drones were just toys even 15 years ago. Now they're tools. And like many other tools in your house and many other appliances, you know, drones are connected to networks. They're part of this web of internet connected devices called the Internet of Things. And your toaster might be connected to a network. Your toothbrush might be connected to network. And your Tesla is definitely connected to a network. And drones are on the network as well. They're really no different at all. And, you know, we talk about the risk to IoT devices. And just to give you an example, some years ago, an international criminal network developed a botnet that actually took captive IoT devices all over the world, including things like literally toasters and microwaves and toothbrushes, and used them to take down corporate websites and actually hold the internet stranglehold based on this network of things that we sort of take for granted. Well, drones are actually a part of that too, and could be vulnerable to hackers and even foreign governments, things like that. So it pays to actually consider cybersecurity on the front end. That's really what the Drone Responders 5 C's recommends. If you go to the next slide. So in a nutshell, the 5 C's recommends 2 things. The first is pretty simple. Many of you out there who are familiar with cybersecurity have heard of something called the NIST Framework for Cybersecurity. At least half of our 50 states have implemented the NIST framework, which is a way of evaluating the risk and then developing sophisticated sort of interlocking measures to assess that risk, to mitigate potential cybersecurity risk, and then to respond to any kind of breaches. It's not built for just drones or just IoT. It applies to every part of your network. So this is something that's worth talking to your IT team to see if you're already complying with the NIST framework. Hopefully so. If not, you know, they should be anyways. And your drones and any other network device you have should also be coupled underneath it. There are some other interesting tools that the 5Cs talk about. One of them is a report put out by IACP, which we highly recommend in 2017, called Managing Cybersecurity Risk. A law enforcement guide. Is a little dated. Things move fast in the cybersecurity world, but still recommend reviewing that after you've looked over the 5Cs. And then another guide that's helpful is a DHS best practices document that they released last year, 2019. They meant it as a companion piece. They called it to this other DHS warning on the risk of sort of foreign manufactured drones in their title. It's definitely worth reviewing if you have concerns about cybersecurity or using sort of untrusted devices in the vernacular of DHS. It's pretty restrictive, but a helpful rubric to help you know how to assess these risks and to calibrate them. So we go to the next slide, please. So the second point on cybersecurity is just, you know, think about it on the front end. And this, before you buy a product, and it's not specific to drones, but before you buy a drone or anything else that is designed and works best when it's connected to network, you should think about cybersecurity. You should be asking a vendor, and this applies to everything, including body cameras, drones, you name it. You should ask about, you know, where does the data go? How is the data stored on the device? Who gets it? Where's the cloud base? What about your supply chain? What does that look like? Are there any vulnerabilities? These are just sort of basic cybersecurity hygiene questions that some agencies do a really great job of, but other agencies are sort of learning and getting up to speed here. And this is an evolving process. And again, it's not specific to drones. Drones are just part of this larger microcosm of network connected devices. And I think the most important point that the 5Cs outlines is really in the last sentence, is that, as the chief said, I mean, the mission should drive your choice of technology, and every piece of technology should be purchased with cybersecurity in mind. And with that, I'll kick it back over to the chief. Thanks.
All right, so in the Homeland Security cybersecurity best practices for operating commercial unmanned aircraft systems, here's some of the things that are referenced. And before I go into this, I want to build on what Brendan said, and I want to say that we're not here to tell you what to do. We have been going through this and hearing from different people asking for some clarity, asking for what references and documentation is out there. So what we've tried to do as best we can is to bring to you authoritative information from those sources that are designed to guide us from the federal agencies of DHS and DOJ and others. And that's all we're trying to do, is to inform you at this point. And so as we go forward, under this area, under A, ensure the devices used for download and installation of UAS software and firmware do not access the enterprise network. These are some of the best practices you can do, especially if you're concerned about a foreign-made drone, if you want to have some guidance. And using Wi-Fi, ensure the data link supports an encryption algorithm for securing Wi-Fi communications, and use the most secure encryption standards available, and complicated encryption keys that are changed regularly. We often get lazy. We have things in place that we're supposed to do even with our passwords. So we've got to make sure that we are doing our due diligence. And then use a standalone computer to connect to the UAS or removable storage device to ensure no access to the internet or enterprise network. And again, these are just some topical areas that you can utilize should you deem it necessary, or if it's in a very secure or sensitive mission that you're flying. Next slide. So the International Association of Chiefs of Police Managing Security Risk, a law enforcement guide, which includes, for instance, that the chief executive or law enforcement executive holds the responsibility, and he's the one that kind of sets the stage for culture and getting people to be engaged in the ways that they need to. And item B is for any technology currently deployed or any new technology being considered, the security capabilities of the technology and security implications of integrating the technology into the organization's operation must be thoroughly evaluated. And I want to add a little bit here back to the original beginnings of this 5Cs discussion. And one of the things that we saw is that there are missions being flown when we really have to be thinking in our mindset, what will this look like in the news? for example, there was a law enforcement agency that was using a drone to fly over a nudist beach to determine if there were violations being made to send someone in. Now, technically, they did nothing wrong, but oftentimes when we look at this from a media perspective, especially in today's hypersensitive world, we know that the headline is going to be something sensational. It's going to be like law enforcement or police officers monitoring nudist, and it's not going to go into any more detail. And I never will forget the one piece of advice that my city manager gave me when I was fire chief. And he said, remember, it's not only what comes up on the 6 o'clock news, it's what is the message that's being conveyed. And if it comes on the 6 o'clock news, it better be good from your department. And his warning to that was, just as I can appoint you as the fire chief, I can also disappoint you. So a very valuable lesson of us thinking through that, because even though it might be helpful, in the end, it may be worse by us taking that mission and doing it. And we've come so far, because if you remember, when we first started this journey, we were facing the negativity of drones because they were perceived as military, as weaponized, as surveillance. And then following the hurricanes, the wildfires, and other activities that we were involved with, we changed that whole perspective, or the whole perspective of people looking at that, saying, hey, drones are really making a huge difference and they're saving lives. And more recently, we saw the report that came out from DJI that has documented hundreds of lives that are being saved by drones. So it's thinking ahead, realizing the circumstances we're in, and trying to make sure we use our best judgment. Next slide. So I want to point out that the 5 C's is a living document. We are going to continue to evolve this and change as the information comes to us. We're going to add a few more things into this. If you have suggested changes, please send them to me at charles@droneresponders.org. We will plug that into the document, and you know, we'll continue to update it as we see things that come forward. And just looking here real quick to see. So what we'll do now is we're going to switch over. We're going to do questions and everything else at the end. And we're going to go right now into a little bit of a teaser where we've been talking about the first responder tactical beyond visual line of sight waiver that's just been announced, I think, at the first session of the FAA symposium. And I'm going to turn this over to Michael O'Shea.
Hey, Charles. Thanks for turning this over to me. So Charles asked me to talk about the what we're calling tactical beyond visual line of sight, and it was announced at the first FAA symposium back earlier this month. And we've actually issued 3 of these. The first one was issued to York County, Virginia last year, and it was sort of our step into whether or not we could do this type of operation. And they did a lot of work, York County did, in providing us their concept of operations and how they could safely operate beyond visual line of sight, or limited beyond visual line of sight. And then just recently we had 2 91-113B waivers issued, which are for to fly beyond visual line of sight for both Pearland, Texas, and also Chula Vista Police Department. So you have to understand that the FAA operates the safest airspace in the world, and their mission is to continue to operate the safest airspace in the world. So everything we do is sort of we look at in terms of what impact does this have on the NAS, or the national airspace. So we always tend to start off slow, and I know that sometimes frustrates people, but we're sort of looking at the trends it causes in terms of the safety of the impact. So we've looked at what York County did, and they were able to operate very successfully. Can you go to the next slide? I don't know if it has a picture, but they were able to operate very successfully. And what tactical beyond visual line of sight essentially is the ability to operate beyond visual line of sight as long as you stay at essentially a very low altitude. So you have a hard ceiling of 400 feet, or the hard ceiling is the facility map altitude value. So if you're flying in controlled airspace and the facility map value is altitude is 300 feet, you have to, that's your hard ceiling. And you can fly out 1,500 feet horizontally, but any structure you go over, whether it's a building, the woods, you know, whatever, you have to remain within 50 feet of that structure. And the reason we do that is because we have sort of a theorem called infrastructure masking and shadowing that says if you're very close to, you know, a power line or to a building top, there should not be any manned aircraft there. In fact, if there's a manned aircraft, their least issue is going to be a 55-pound or less drone, because on their way to hitting the power lines or the top of that building or a hill. So this gives you the ability to do that without any prior authorization from the FAA, as long as you get the waiver. You can do this in essentially any airspace, even controlled airspace. You can do it at night. In controlled airspace, like I said, you have to operate below the facility map altitude values. And then in uncontrolled airspace, you have a hard ceiling of 400 feet. The important thing to remember, this is only for emergency missions. So in other words, this is not something you just go out and say, hey, I'm going to go out and use this to, look to what's on the other side of that hill for fun. It has to be something that that represents either a life-saving mission for people on the ground, your constituents, or for your public safety officers. Something that would either protect them or protect the people on the ground. So if you're looking for a lost kid in the woods and you need to go over the hill or over the trees, the fact that you could save that kid's life by finding him definitely meets the definition of a life-saving mission. The same thing if you have, officers are responding to a barricaded subject, or you have a structure fire. Those are all things where people's lives can be in danger, where you can reduce that risk by flying this aircraft out beyond visual line of sight to these parameters, 400-foot hard ceiling and 1,500 feet horizontally. The important thing to remember is that as soon as the operation is concluded, you need to go back to visual line of sight. This is only supposed to be a temporary procedure to allow you to see on the other side of that hill, to see on the other side of that structure. It's not designed to be something that you're going to do in a long-term, for a long-term event. You're going to do it just as long as you actually need to do it. The process we have, where we're working to get this done, is essentially a two-step process. What you'll do with us is, and we hope to provide you a resource guide by the FAA symposium later this month in August. But essentially what we're going to ask of you is to sort of follow the guidelines on that resource guide. And it's going to talk about it being a two-step process. The first step is you're going to send your concept of operations and the safety information and mitigation of the airspace you fly in and the aircraft you fly. And you're going to send that to our 91113 waiver team. They're going to evaluate that. And if they feel like it meets the criteria, they're going to tell you to submit a COA for our 91113 and our CAP system. And then once that's issued and you have it in your hand, you can actually conduct these operations. It's important to note that you have to have a public aircraft COA before you can actually apply for this. And the reason why is because one of the things that public aircraft COA gives you is the ability to self-certify your own aircraft, so you can certify it for limited operations over people in case of an emergency. It's something you don't currently get with 107, so it has to be done under a public aircraft operation. So you get the ability to fly over people, because obviously if you can't see the aircraft, you don't know if you're actually flying over somebody. And then you get the ability to fly beyond visual line of sight up to these parameters, 400-foot hard ceiling, 1,500 feet horizontally. Next slide.
Let me take this one and then we'll get back to questions if that's okay with you.
Sure.
So one, I wanted to recognize a few people here that were involved in this that made a huge difference. Chula Vista, California Police Department, the San Diego IPP, Captain Vern Salee, and Program Manager, San Diego IPP, Caitlin McCauley, York County, Virginia Rover Team, Deputy Chief Chris Sadler down there, City of Pearland, Texas, Police Officer Brandon Carr, Skydio, both Brendan and Fritz Reber, their Director of Public Safety, and there have been others that have been involved in this overall collective, but I wanted to make sure that we didn't forget that as we passed. And if we go to the next slide, I do have a question here that came up. Hold on a second for me to Michael O'Shea. It says, can you train under the TBV LOS? Otherwise, how can you be proficient and test your operations?
So that's a really good question, and that I really don't have a good answer to. Right now, that you cannot train under a public aircraft COA. And that's something we're trying to work through right now, because obviously we feel that creates an unsafe situation, just like you've described. So currently you cannot. So, I mean, you can certainly practice, flying above a building, 50 feet above a building, keeping it within visual line of sight under your 107 or under a public aircraft COA if you're actually on a mission. But you can't train specifically for tactical beyond visual line of sight and actually fly beyond visual line of sight.
So we're saying working on it.
Yeah. So, and I think I've made this very clear with, if you've talked to me about this before, and I know Charles has, it's something that concerns us. And, it's obviously an issue for unmanned aircraft systems, but it's even a greater issue with manned aircraft, where you have somebody who may got a excess government property program aircraft like an OH-58, a Bell Jet Ranger, and they may be doing like bucket operations, picking up water and dropping on fire. Well, that's something that they will not be able to train with in that aircraft, because it's only certificated as a public aircraft. It doesn't have a civil registration. And you can't take a civil registration aircraft and do that kind of stuff, because most of those are only allowed under public aircraft operations. So I think we understand in the FAA that this may create an unsafe flight condition and impact the NASA in an unsafe way. So we're working, trying to come up with a solution.
Okay, next slide. So now I've got a couple questions. One comes up that's addressed to you, Brendan, and it says, some other drone manufacturers have had their products evaluated by the government and or third-party auditors. What cybersecurity audits has Skydio's drones gone through to ensure that they are safe?
Yeah, that's a great question. So last year, Congress passed a law in December, the National Defense Authorization Act. It included the provision, some of you may have heard about it, Section 848, applies to the Department of Defense, and it basically requires the Department of Defense to buy products, drones that are cyber secure and have a very high level of supply chain security too. So Skydio is one of the handful of companies that is compliant with Section 848, and that's coming from the Department of Defense after a rigorous, months-long cybersecurity evaluation that involved, actually reverse engineering all of the Skydio's products, which is why they're widely used by the defense community today, not only here but by other nations as well. So yeah, that's the product of a long-running evaluation in the government. And so we welcome those sort of evaluations across the board. That's something that all vendors should be doing. I know others have done external evaluations as well.
Okay, then I have another question, and I'm not sure who this goes to. It says, how do you mitigate the risk where you are unable to use your asset unless you get an unlock from another government, China via DJI, that require you to send sensitive documents, official ID, copy of contracts, MOUs, etc.? Anybody care to jump on that one?
You can review the DHS guidance on that. It doesn't answer the question specifically, but the DHS guidance, again, is pretty restrictive. It basically would require you to use air-gapped solutions to touch the drone or anything that touches the drone. So buy separate iPhones, separate computers, everything else to fly it. And would suggest, not communicating via network. But again, I would just refer you to the DHS guidance. That's probably your best source for throwing your questions like that.
And then I have another question. It says, how is the FAA looking at approval for the Matrix M300 with the first-person view and payload, as well as the ability to hand off control as it pertains to TBV LOS? Mike, do you care to jump on that one?
So I'll try to handle this in a couple of steps here. First of all, in terms of certification of aircraft, we do have a process in place to allow the certification of unmanned aircraft systems. We call it the DNR process, which stands for Durability and Reliability Testing. And it's basically based on flight hours, test cards, which are, you fly in high humidity, high altitude, low altitude, or sea spray on the aircraft and stuff. And you fly so many hours based on population. And in the greater populations you go to per square mile, the more hours you have to fly. So I don't know if Matisse is in the process or DJI is in the process of trying to certify these aircraft. One of the issues in certifying an aircraft with the FAA is it sort of freezes the configuration. In other words, I have a little DJI Spark. I know that about every 3 or 4 weeks, they do a software update to it. But when you send something else to certify, you have to freeze the configuration, because whatever we certify has to be what's eventually produced. And it can't change from that. So that creates an issue with companies who continuously update their software or change their products on a regular basis. Because, when you build a 707, we know when we get that aircraft, what you build is going to be the aircraft we certified. And there are steps that you can actually change, if you have additions or changes to that aircraft, you could take after the certification process. So that's the answer to that question. And I forgot what the second part was.
I've cleared it now, so I don't see it.
Dang.
And I can't go back and refer it. So, well, let me see. Maybe I can. Here we go. I did find it. It's okay. It was how was the FAA looking at approval for the M300 and payload, as well as the ability to hand off control as it pertains to TBV LOS?
So handoff controls is something the FAA's looked a lot in terms of aviation safety. And the reason why, and I don't know specifically how you're talking about this, but we have the ability, or some operators have the ability, to hand off the operations of that aircraft from one ground control system to the next ground control system. And I don't know if that's where you're going at, but if you are, we've done a lot of work because we found some of these systems, there's a lag time. So it takes a little bit of time before GCS2 picks up what GCS1 was doing. And because of that, you have an aircraft that's basically flying uncontrolled. You know, if it's flying at 30 miles per hour and there's 10 seconds of lapse time, then no one's controlling the aircraft in the national airspace for a certain amount of time, going a certain amount of speed and a certain amount of distance. So that's been an issue. So we've worked with manufacturers to make sure that if you do create a system that does a handoff, that there's no time lag involved, and it's a seamless handover, because we've had issues in the past where we had some vendors who had systems that, because of the lag, it created issues.
And in a lot of these processes, you can correct me if I'm wrong, there's a process of evaluating and providing data on the reliability of these systems that you all look at as the FAA to determine whether you approve something.
There are, and you need to understand that most of these commercially available off-the-shelf equipment, the DJIs of the world and others, there is no certification process with the FAA. We basically, the onus is on you to tell us that you're flying an aircraft that you think is safe to fly in the national airspace. The reason why they're very well regulated, and the reason that people ask us all the time, well, why can't I fly a 4-pound drone over somebody's head and you're flying a 747 over our head? And the reason why is because that 747 goes through a very strenuous certification process, and then it also goes through a production certificate process to make sure you're producing the aircraft that we certified. Whereas these things that are commercial off the shelf, we have no idea what's in them. We have no idea if there's redundant systems. We have no idea if there's going to be interference. It's not a matter if it's going to fall out of the sky, it's when it's going to fall out of the sky. And when it does, we don't want it to hit somebody and hurt them.
Okay, and then I've got a question here I'm going to take a stab at, and you can follow up after, Mike, if you like. It says, how do you avoid interference with unknown drones, clueless, careless, and criminal while operating TBV LOS? And my answer would be, you're probably not going to be able to, but the risk is so small because of the height that you're flying at, the distance from the ground, and in the situations that we're flying in, more than likely we're going to control the perimeter. You got anything to add to that, Mike?
That's pretty good. And I don't really want to get into like the big sky theory where, there's a big sky and there's lots of space for everyone to be at. But in reality, you're right, because of the infrastructure masking and shadowing, staying so close to the structures that it's sort of a defined incident perimeter, the likelihood is very small that you would encounter somebody. And hopefully, I don't know what the rules are in your states or respective entities, but if it interferes with the operations of a public safety officer, you can certainly take your own action to tell them that they need to cease and desist or move on. But and if it's at a wildfire and you're operating and a drone shows up, then there's federal law that applies that would prohibit them from operating that there, and they can be fined. But you still have to be cognizant of what's going on. You still have to sort of be visually looking at the airspace. And like I said, this is only supposed to be a temporary thing. You're only supposed to fly beyond visual line of sight, because you have to. Because you have to look on the other side of those trees to see if the lost kid is there, or you need to look on the other side of that building to see if there's a hot spot there as well, or you need to see if there's a deputy eating pit bull in the backyard, so you need to fly over on the other side of that house. But it's not supposed to be a long-term event. You're not supposed to be putting yourself in danger for a long-term event, and that's why we call these tactical beyond visual line of sight. The reason they call it that name is because they want people to be very cognizant of the fact that it's only for very tactical type situations. Which are what we're considering very emergency situations where life-saving is involved.
So another question that came in says, say an agency has a large special event like the Super Bowl, would UAS ops in the planning stages qualify for this beyond visual line of sight?
Say that again?
In a situation where an agency has a large special event like the Super Bowl, would these UAS beyond visual line of sight ops be available in the planning stages?
In the planning stages?
Yep, that's what it
I,
says.
I guess I'm not really sure what you're asking, but you know, at an event like the Super Bowl, we pretty much issue a temporary flight restriction and pretty much shut down all operations. And in fact, the Super Bowl, Brandon can tell you about how we respond to the FBI, how they do their counter UAS systems in place, and how we actually take active mitigation to reduce the number of aircraft that are in this airspace because of the potential harm to the large crowds. The question about whether or not you can sort of train pre-plan for this, the answer is, if that's not a life-saving event at that point, the answer would be no.
Okay. And then it says, another question is, if a public safety agency flies strictly under Part 107, will the FAA ever consider allowing TBV loss as a waiver to 107.31 if the application outlines same mitigating factors as was already stated?
So that's a good question, and it's something we had probably a very lengthy discussion on. The issue right now is, the answer is we could, but you have to satisfy a requirement that you automatically get with a public aircraft, which is flights over people. You have to satisfy that requirement under 107. So to get flights over people under 107, you have to provide the FAA with all the safety mitigations that gives us a compliance of safety that's equal to or greater than, than what we're getting with public aircraft. But you have to tell us stuff like, I have a parachute, or I have a defined incident perimeter when I do this, so nobody else is supposed to be in there, or people aren't supposed to be there. And there are a lot of steps you're going to have to jump through. But the answer is, yeah, you could. But we sort of decided, because the initial thing is to see what kind of impact this process has on the national airspace in terms of safety. We would first limit it to public aircraft operations. And if there's not an issue with that, we would sort of grow it from there.
Thanks. Now I have a question for Brendan. It's a follow-up question in the security issue. It says, you mentioned Section 848 in DAA, that is only where the drone is made as a metric. Obviously, products made in the U.S. are equally capable of having vulnerabilities. What audits have been done to ensure Skydio's cyber and data security?
Yeah, great question again. So it's not true. Section 848 is actually much broader than that. It actually goes into the supply chain and has exhaustive requirements to ensure against vulnerabilities. So it's very difficult to comply with Section 848 because you have to approach cybersecurity and supply chain as a systems process from the beginning, and the entire architecture has to revolve around these high levels of cybersecurity and supply chain to ensure against vulnerabilities like that. So Section 848 is actually much broader and much more demanding than that. And I should say, cybersecurity is my background. So I grew up as an Air Force officer where I was a cybersecurity advisor. I was at the National Security Agency as the special counsel to the general counsel, and was the chief cyber operations, really the senior cyber operations officer to the Deputy Attorney General of Justice. And I teach cybersecurity law and policy as well. So this is something that Skydio and some other companies take very seriously, doing what we call security by design. So not security as an afterthought, which is so often been the case for IoT devices, including drones. So again, on our end, we not only comply with Section 848, which is much broader than where the drone is made, but we've also undergone multiple rounds of successive reviews by government agencies, to include military services, that have included extremely rigorous, even reverse engineering of the software and hardware architecture that goes into our product. And that's why the products are widely used across the military and federal agencies, because they meet those high cybersecurity standards, which are really, really difficult to do. One reason I was excited to join. And again, I think what's good is that we're seeing more companies spend more time doing security by design. It's going to be good for everybody, including Skydio, but really across the entire industry.
Thanks, Brendan. I have a question here. This is for Mike O'Shea. It says, is it expected that public use, UAS, law enforcement, et cetera, will be able to waive all or part remote ID requirements?
The answer is, we're not sure yet, and because we're still in the rulemaking process, I'm actually not allowed to talk to the rule. But just to let you know that it's in the process of being reviewed. We did review all 57,000 comments and read all the comments, but I don't know what the final rule is going to be.
Okay. Another question for you, Mike. I think I can answer this myself, but it says, does the tactical waiver apply regarding search and rescue? comma, flying a large grid pattern in a rural setting. And I think the limitation is 1,500 feet laterally. That's the limitation currently.
That's correct.
It's baby steps, and I think all of this leads to, somewhere down the road, I believe there's probably going to be certification of aircraft, which is going to change some of the dynamics of what we're able to do, as well as beyond visual line of sight. Sense and avoid technology, and those kind of things. That seem about right, Mike?
Yeah, we always try to tell people that, operating beyond visual line of sight is sort of a two-step process. First, you have to have the ability to fly over people, and shows that you can do that safely. Then you have to have the mitigations to allow you to fly beyond. You have to meet 91.113, which basically says you must sense and avoid other aircraft and be able to take adequate action to deconflict from that aircraft. And you're right, the technology is not quite there, but it's certainly coming. And we've seen very smart video analytics systems that basically are cameras around the aircraft that can see a bird, obviously can see a lot better than the human eye, and make a determination whether that their flight direction is going to impact your direction, and whether or not you should take action. And we've also seen some smart acoustic systems, and we've seen some very small radar systems that are about the size of a cell phone that are pretty good, but they're very limited in range right now. But I think as the technology grows, the range will grow, and the prices will come down.
And then, Brendan, I have another question for you. How do you handle firmware upgrades on a certified aircraft?
Yeah, so I assume that's talking about sort of going towards type certified aircraft, and I can't say too much other than this is something Skydio is very much interested in. And I think we'll have more to say about that at a later date, but firmware, the FAA, and Mike touched on this a little bit, he's right. Of course, software matters, right? Firmware affects system behavior. But for both FAA type certification and Department of Defense type certification of aircraft, there are different sort of hierarchies of software. Some might be sort of tier 1 that must be reviewed the same way that a piece of new hardware would be reviewed. And others might be, tier 2 or 3, where they could be released with a lower level of review and approval much more quickly. So the FAA has had to deal with that on for instance, fighter aircraft. They're really flying supercomputers now. So this is not the FAA's first rodeo, not DoD's first rodeo with certifying firmware and software. There are ways to analyze the risk involved and then calibrate the level of review appropriate to the risk. And we've actually seen FAA be very much supportive of how do we get to certifying autonomy, which is top of mind for companies like Skydio that push the envelope of autonomous flight. I think it's top of mind for folks like the FAA as well to get that level of trustworthiness behind unmanned aircraft.
Okay, then this one is a jog back to Mike. I think I know the answer to this one too, but I'll let you do it. Is the range of the tactical waiver able to be increased with the use of visual observers?
So the answer is no, because of visual observers, but the answer is yes. And the way the answer is yes is anytime you need to exceed the parameters of the Tactical Beyond Visual Line of Sight 9113 little b waiver, is you contact the Systems Operations Support Center and request an SGI. And what we're doing right now is working with them to let them know that in the future, there's going to probably be a lot of agencies that have this Tactical Beyond Visual Line of Sight waiver. And there'll be cases where they're going to need to exceed that 400-foot hard ceiling, or there's cases where they're going to need to go more than 1,500 feet, and they can justify it by saying, we're in a very rural area, or, we have a large defined incident perimeter, or, because, we really need to save somebody's life, we need to go a little farther. And it would be up to the Systems Operations Support Center whether or not to issue an SGI or a special governmental interest, which is also known as an emergency COA. But that's how that process would work.
Okay, and then another question for you, Mike. It says, you meant to ask about public aircraft self-certified under a COA. Does an agency need to recertify?
Say that again?
As far as public aircraft self-certified, I guess that's for airworthiness under a COA, does an agency need to recertify?
So you basically make a claim to us every time you renew your COA that you believe that your aircraft is fit for flight and fit for purposes or whatever you're doing. What we typically recommend to people is the head of your agency signs a letter saying, we believe that this product, Acme drone is safe and fit for purposes, and it'll be effective for us to use in these type of situations and won't impact the safety of the national airspace. I always used to joke that when we were working the 1033 program at DOJ and we're giving people helicopters, that a lot of times the chiefs sometimes don't realize what they're signing, but it's very important you think this through. And it's really important to look at that aircraft and make sure it is a safe aircraft to fly in the national airspace, because you're making a determination. You're telling us, the FAA, that based on what you know, this aircraft is safe to fly in the NAS. And that's why we give you greater privileges under public aircraft law, like flying over people in case of an emergency.
Well, that basically covers all of our questions to date. So I thank all of the panelists for being here, and I'll give you one last chance to say anything that you'd like to say as we wrap up, and I'll start with you, Chad.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add. Great conversation. I know there's a lot of agencies in my area, and I'm sure across the country, that are very interested in that remote ID as that goes forward. I know we have to wait for the final rule to come out, but that will be an interesting one as we go forward. If all the public safety agencies are forced to abandon their current drones and buy new ones, that'll be interesting. But we'll see what happens.
Mike O'Shea?
Yeah, I was just going to tell you that, the FAA, we have a pretty dedicated public safety support team that are around to answer your questions and to kind of work with you. I'm happy to get on a phone call or a Zoom call with you and sort of talk through your operations if you have questions. I have a lot of agencies that call me on a regular basis just to say, hey, we're thinking about doing this. What do you think about that? What's this going to impact, or what's the issue here? And we deal with a lot of agencies that are starting programs too that want to know, how do I start? In fact, I just got off the phone call before this thing, talking with a rural fire district in Colorado who wants to start a UAS program. And that's something we're more than happy to do and work with you. And I'm sure Charles will provide my email address. Feel free to reach out to me if you guys have questions or concerns.
And Brendan?
Yeah, one thing I would say is just food for thought is when you're engaging with oversight authorities, you might consider actually certifying your compliance with the 5 Cs and telling the city council, well, here's what we're following in civil liberties and privacy and community engagement. I think that's going to build a lot of trust and go a long way. And ultimately, it's, again, this is a real credit for drone responders and Chief Warner, but I think it's going to help all of us in the long run. Over. Thanks.
Thanks. And we have an outreach program that we're going to put out, and we're actually going to add the 5 Cs into it so that it actually gives a methodology of how to do this in your community for town hall meetings and presenting the information to maintain that transparency so that everybody gets the information that Chad talked about early on, saying from the very beginning, throughout your process, and as you change, you need to inform them of what you're doing and what's happening next. And we did have one last question that slipped in here, and I'm going to try to cover it really quick. It says, how does flying inside a building fit into the tactical waiver? I think the answer to simple that is it's not in regulated airspace, so it's not really impacted by any FAA regulations. So you can fly beyond visual line of sight inside buildings all you like, because you're not in the national airspace. And with that, that's a wrap for today. I thank all the panelists for being here. I thank Skydio for being a partner and helping collaborate with these 5 Cs. And Mike, as always, thank you for your appreciation for your support of public safety. One last note for FAA, I want to let you know that our survey that we did, the survey says that 64% of the public safety people that responded, that the FAA is responsive to their public safety needs. So thank you to the FAA and the team there that's helping us so much. With that, signing off. Thank you all.